Hello and welcome to Wild Wisdom podcast. My name is Chelsea Bess Marie, or LC for short.
And I am Madison Murphy Barney, but you can call me Ed. Together, we are the Cedar Siblings. We are two-spirit indigenous folks who are endlessly interested in how we can apply the wisdom, creativity, and resilience of the natural world into our everyday lives.
We noticed that we spend a lot of time standing in two worlds as indigenous people, as two-spirit people, and also as professionals. This constant switching can be challenging in the best of times, but even more so in this moment.
This podcast is one of our attempts to not only do less code switching, but to bring our worlds closer together and in a balanced way that invites listeners to learn from the natural world as we take on this group project of collective survival and liberation.
On each episode of this podcast, we focus on one species and their characteristics that can offer us guidance during the tumultuous times we live in. This week, we'll be learning from cattails.
Before we begin our discussion of cattails, we wanted to remind you that you can support our work by joining our Patreon at Cedar Siblings and Instagram. We'd also love to hear from you via email at wildwisdompod@gmail.com.
All right. With that, we invite you to take a deep breath, if you can, or take a moment to ground and cleanse, and away we go.
Okay, so we are talking about cattails today, and cattails are really tall, herbaceous plants. They're in the wetlands. You often see them like on the edges of lakes or ponds or marshes. And they are really unique. I mean, growing up, my main use of cattails was hitting my brothers with them because then all of the fluff would fly off, and I loved that. So I have a different appreciation for them now as adults than I did then when they were just a tool for hitting my brothers with. And they also have they're culturally significant to many different cultures and groups of people and have been used by humans for food, materials, and design for centuries. So they are really tall. Probably taller than you and I, definitely taller than I, but I'm only 5 feet tall. And they grow really rapidly and they create these dense stands and they spread through their rhizomes, like underground through their stems, as well as the dispersed seeds that fluff at the top in the brown when you like set it free. Those are all the seeds. A little bit like a dandelion, like in the sense that when you set them all free, you see them go. And they can take over water and wetlands, and thus are like really important pillars in wetland ecosystems. They thrive in saturated soils and can grow with low oxygen levels. And part of this is because their roots can absorb oxygen through the air spaces in their stems. And so they tolerate really nutrient-rich, sometimes polluted waters, enabling them to grow in challenging conditions, which is key and, allow them to sort of root in a way that then later can make space for other species in polluted areas. They produce tall green leaves and the brown seed heads as well. During the winter, the above ground portions die back while the rhizomes under the soil store energy for regrowth in the spring. And the dense stands of cattails, you often see, like you very rarely see a cattail. It's, they grow together in these really sort of dense stands and they create a natural barrier that reduces wave and protects waves and protects shorelines from soil erosion. And so they create sort of like a seawall, if you will. And their rapid growth often outcompetes other plant species in disturbed wetland areas. And they are really important for the environments and ecosystems around them. They, as I mentioned, absorb excess nutrients, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus from the water, and they prevent in this way harmful and overly abundant algae blooms. And they also trap sediments and pollutants, which improves the water clarity and quality where they grow. And cattails provide food. We can eat them. Maybe you have eaten them. You can like peel them back and eat them, and they can be, I like the texture of them. I like chewing them. And one time I was at the park with my nephews and feeding them cattails, and my sister-in-law was like, we don't want to be that family. And I was like, but yeah, we do. Yeah, so they provide food for us, for others, for nesting sites, cover and protection for other species, including birds, fish, amphibians, and insects. And their dense foliage is sort of a haven for aquatic organisms and small mammals looking for shade, for protection, things like that. As I mentioned, they grow really fast, and as a fast-growing plant, they capture and store a lot of carbon dioxide, and in this way contribute to climate change mitigation. And because they have that spongy nature and that they soak up so much, they slow water flow and absorb excess water, which can reduce the risk of flooding downstream from where they grow. And yeah, so they're like a little home for many organisms for themselves. And they, are like a filtration system and contribute to the health and diversity of the ecosystems that you find them in. And yeah, they pave the way. They're sort of I wish there's another word for like pioneer in this way, but they're like a pioneer.
Founding.
Yeah, they're a founding relative. Yeah, and so I think there's just a lot we can learn from them in terms of, the thing that immediately comes to mind is like going into the muck and just deciding that you can like be in the mess and hold the mess and and when we allow ourselves to be in the mess. I think so often it's hard for me to keep context or like perspective on like what can come after that when it's just like, wow, I'm just stuck in this like murky in between area. But like I think cattails really shows that the murky, just being in the murky in between area with other folks like allows for in the months and weeks to come a haven for other species and like an ability for land to heal, and they're like a healing species in that way. But we don't get that if everyone is afraid of being in the mess of it all, which isn't always a fun place to be, but it's an important place to be, and it can be I think, disheartening place to be sometimes because you don't always see the change, um, or the impact, but it's where the most work happens in my experience. Yeah, and then also, I think there's something to be said about the alchemy of cattails, and like how we can mirror that too of in being a filtration system and alchemizing and using energy of things that are seen as like pollutants or bad, but like reutilizing that to like grow stronger bonds and like change that energy into collective collaboration is such a lesson for our time right now. I think so often we like have a lot of energy and passion towards things, and then that energy can get sort of like burned off or wasted in some ways rather than like alchemized into like actual communal protection. Chelsea, did you grow up eating cattails?
Not officially, but kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
I grew up on what I now would call a family compound, but I grew up in this little triangular area where my grandparents lived up the pasture, and then my great grandparents were there as well, or my great grandmother. And my aunt and uncle lived in another house, and then we lived down the field from both of them. And in between us were these pastures and then this pond,
Mm.
and the pond was always surrounded with cattails. And I too may have hit a sibling or two, cousin or two here and there. But yeah, loved munching on them, loved seeing the little fluff just fly everywhere in the
Mhm, the
air with their
fan.
little parachutes. So yeah,
Yeah, and I guess not to be too on the nose, but there is something about like the idea of, they spread underground, which our strongest movements like spread underground and have that like connective strength that can be seen and unseen. And then also that like above ground portion that's like sort of that enchanting and beautiful, like, wow, I want to be a part of that. And I think like it's like there's such a good model for movement structure of like a strong held root system growing underground constantly and keeping, folks and other species safe, and then at the same time having that like, let's call it a more like public facing like enchantment of like, here's where we're going, this is what we're doing, like we're building a better world for all of us, and like seeing how that spreads above ground as well due to a solid movement underground.
I mean, I love willows, I love cedar, I love all the relatives that we've talked about before, but I really feel like the cattails are the goats. They are not concerned about getting their hands dirty, we'll say. Go do the work that nobody else wants to do. They can grow from the tiniest little like fragment, the tiniest little ember. As long as that is there, they can grow and spread. They clean and filter and protect, and you can eat them. Like
Mhm.
many of the other relatives, you can't eat them, right?
Yeah.
And so they just do so much. And I think their strategy, right? I think I'm someone who really values strategy. And, that's what I do in my job and career is I've often focused on strategy and helping folks develop strategies for
Mhm.
different things. And I think there's so much to learn about the idea that it doesn't matter what environment you're in. It's about the strategies that you employ and develop and who you work with and who you communicate with. And so I think that these are, yeah, just like fascinating worker, like, founder types of plants relatives. And I love it.
Yeah, there's a real like community organizing lesson here of like sort of going where there's what looks to be, like a wasteland almost. Not that any community is that. I'm saying like in the cattail sense, going where there it seems like things can seem hopeless or like it up against a big battle, and then just going and like slowly step by step, algae by algae, alchemy by alchemy, like transforming these barren landscapes into thriving places. And I think that we overcomplicate it sometimes. And I think cattails teach us that like it is step by step, bit by bit, like establishing ourselves as, beings and relatives that will like be there and enable sort of long-term ecosystem development through being a pillar that like other folks can, find their way once there's that like clarity caused or like allowed by the cattail presence.
Yeah. Well, and so many things can eat them, right?
Hmm.
And so when you're thinking about an environment, much like the one we're living in right now, where it feels like all the resources are depleting and we're just trudging through shit, with lack of a better way to say this, on a daily basis, that they can come in and thrive in and dig in, pick their strategies, but not only do that, but also make sure that all of the other species that maybe haven't figured it out yet, that they're like a stable force for them to be able to receive nutrients and to
Hmm.
survive,
Hmm.
right, in this environment that feels so unmanageable, so sick, so depleted. And there's like, we need to find our cattails. Like, we need to know who our cattails are in this moment in time. And we need to help be cattails too,
Hmm.
right? Like, I think there are moments in time where we can all provide that stability to other folks, and we like really digging into what are our strategies, what are we most equipped to do and provide in moments like this, and how can we help emulate our relative the cattail to make sure that we are providing nutrition for both ourselves, right, and for the community around us that maybe hasn't figured that strategy out yet, or needs just a little bit of nourishment in order to be able to right themselves and be in a space to be able to find their strategies. And so, yeah, I love that about them.
Yeah. And I think so often we focus, like you and I specifically, but also as a collective, focus on reciprocity and the importance of reciprocity. And cattails are a good lesson in being there regardless, doing the work regardless. And even if, there are other folks just like just benefiting from the presence of a cattail and not seeming to like contribute another way, it's like it allows that long-term view of I'll be here anyway. I'll do it anyway, because like who's to say that the transformation of the ecosystem won't make other things possible, but I think it allows that long view of reciprocity over the course of like generation and over the course of time, as opposed to like transactional reciprocity, which I think we can get really trapped in often.
Yeah. There's a lot of research that I feel like backs this up too, right? We know that, Indigenous and Black feminists have been ringing the bell of collective care is self-care for ever and ever and ever, right? And we just talked about this before, right? You and I have not delved super deep into a lot of our personal muck in these episodes. And sometimes we do before the episodes.
Mhm.
And, talking about we have a tendency, or really we've even been trained to have a tendency for this hyper independence when things go wrong, when the environment's shitty, when we're dealing with a lot, we have a tendency to want to go into ourselves and to figure it out on our own. And we can do that, right? We've been conditioned and trained to do that. And we know from research, we know from how we feel when we're in community and we actually are vulnerable and allow folks to help us or allow folks to just be with us, that we feel better when we are struggling alongside folks that we care about, that care for us, that we have that reciprocity with. There's this research study that I just learned about yesterday that has been really resonant for me, and I think it connects to another kind of like communal message. And they recently discovered in some research that treating the DNA, trying to like wipe out the mutations in DNA that cause cancer, have been effective forever. And that's been our strategy, right? And they, through this research, have discovered that it actually has to do with the communication between the cells. When cancer happens, there's this bioelectric field that basically each cell is like a battery. And when cancer happens, a cell's forgotten who it is and forgets to function as it's supposed to alongside the other electromagnetic fields of the other cells. They, instead of trying to change the DNA and cancel out and blot out and kill the cell, they've started communicating with it differently, reprogramming the bioelectrical field around these cells. And eventually the cell remembers who it is and it comes
Mm.
back and rejoins the rest of the body and the cancer goes away. And I feel like we're dealing with lots of health crises in our personal lives. And I've dealt with a lot of cancer in my family circle in life and community circle in life. And I think not only is that, exciting for those horizons, but I think the other thing that's a lesson that's been hitting me is how do we wrap around and remessage to people who they are? How do we reprogram all of us to understand that we are one? Like
Mhm.
we are all part of that bioelectric field together. The way that we communicate to each other, the way that we wrap around each other, the way that we do that red road, right? Walk the red road home. How do we help folks come back to what is at that core? And I think, again, relatives like the cattail are a good example of, regardless of what's going on, I'm going to stay steadfast and true to being in the muck alongside my siblings, to contributing the strategies that I know, contributing the benefits that I know. And I know that the community is also going to pour back into me. And when we're doing it together, when we're alongside each other, we can be more resilient. We have more strategies together. We have more ability together to be able to completely revolutionize the way that that ecosystem looks when we're all contributing our skills, when we're all figuring out how to work together in symbiosis and not as this colonized, hierarchical, power-ridden system.
Yeah, yeah, and that it's okay if sometimes we are the species that are just seeking shelter for a little bit while we do that remembering and do that. And like I've been getting frustrated with myself recently of like I heard this thing that was really helpful for me and it was that like one way we can look at what's happening right now on the world stage is similar to what happens in relationships when we like turn away from or sort of unplug ourselves from abusive people. And it's like we're kind of doing that from an abusive system. And in doing that, like the abusive system and person in the like gets louder and bigger and whatever because it's like sort of their last stand and that last fear. And so I've really found myself having a like harder time than ever sort of just continuing to like unplug myself and and remember that like this is one version of reality but it isn't the one that we have to always live in. um and so just to say that like that for all of us that deprogramming work and that um, there's a reason that it feels so hard right now to look away from that and look towards, the teachings of a cattail of just being the like that strong, solid force that's just there. And if you need to shelter under, that's okay too. And take your time because it's just like it's a time where everything feels so urgent. And we learn that like this true alchemy happens over generations. And in as you mentioned and said so beautifully with like the cells remembering who they are and like us remembering that in some ways we are a cell of a whole one intertwined organism um and that the journey back to remembering can be filled with grief because it can be really sad to realize what we've forgotten and why we've forgotten it. And like it, I just, it's, we have a lot of forgiveness to offer ourselves too in just like, the powers that programmed us away from our true nature are so strong, and that's by design. But as they get louder, that doesn't mean they're actually getting stronger. It just means they realize, that the time is limited on their sort of reign. And so that was a little bit roundabout, but it just made me think of like the importance of, yes, remembering, and also just allowing yourself to grieve and understand why you'd forgotten, because it was like, it's basically almost impossible to live in the world we live in and not forget at times like who we are and how we're connected and that we all are one.
Yeah. I think it's so important what you're saying about the louder not actually being, not even truer,
Right.
right? And it being just one narrative of
Mhm.
what our reality is. And I think that's another tool of colonization, is focusing on the negative things that are happening and
Mhm.
focusing on all of the crises, all of the the storying of everything is on fire, that keeps folks in fear and survival mode and not able to see the beautiful things that are happening or the things that are working. And unplugging, I think, is so important. Taking rest, taking care of our bodies, making sure that we are making ourselves the best asset to our community possible. Um, there have been so many times throughout history where collective care, community care, mutual aid, right, have been so effective in being able to restory and
Mhm.
eliminate um, our, the story that we've been told, that all of those things are necessary. That's the only way that things can be. That's the only reality that there is. And, the independence and the turning away from collective and the trying to solve everything on our own is what continues that story, right? We have seen that when we're all pitching in, we're all giving to each other, when we're all willing to be vulnerable, when we're all willing to try to take accountability for ourselves, to focus and center repair, to focus and center the whole, that people do better, right?
Mhm.
We don't feel the same way that we do. We don't have as much need to do rest and block out the chaos, because our reality is vastly different in community than it is outside of community. And yeah, there's lots of wounds and yucky shit to clean up from everything that we've been programmed into. But if we're able to keep moving through the muck, we're able to keep repairing, we're able to keep turning towards each other, we're able to take accountability for ourselves, we are better off when we're able to support and be part of that one bioelectric field, right?
Right.
And I think cattails, man, they're a pillar. They're cleaning up their shit. They're cleaning up
Right.
other shit. They're still providing, right?
Yeah.
They're still finding a way to be resilient. I think that's one of the things that's really phenomenal about our community and many other communities of color, is that boy, have we waded through some shit. Boy, are
Mhm.
we still wading through some shit. And we still have so much beauty and resilience. And we have so many folks that have so much wisdom because they have been able to figure out those strategies. And cattails. That's all I
Cattails.
gotta say, man.
And I think, yeah, and it just is a reminder that if we don't look at the shit and wade through it, we can't have that beautiful transformation that's possible when cattails come in and transform an ecosystem. Like, we don't get where we want to go by just ignoring the harm and ignoring the mess and whatever. Like, it's only when we truly look at it and alchemize it that we can get there. And like, I think a lot of our movements have fallen apart because we're doing more of the ignoring and the ideation than the like, this is what we have to walk through to get there.
Like the soul independent piece, right, is investigating your own shit
Yeah.
and trying to work towards healing every single day. That red road every day is our responsibility to the collective, right? It's not just our responsibility to ourselves, it's our responsibility to our relatives.
Yeah, indeed. Especially as we are the relatives who have, collectively as humans caused the most scarring to the earth. It is also that we are going to have to be the ones to do the most healing of it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, Cattails.
Thanks, Em.
Bye.